Hello, everyone. My name is McKinley Keener, and the title of my presentation today is Trauma Before the Traumatic, The Ethics of Witness in Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things. First, I should give a brief overview of the novel and some of its main characters. The God of Small Things follows the experiences of two twins, Estha and Rahel, and their extended family in Kerala, India in 1969. When the twins' English cousin, Sophie Mole, comes to visit, terrible events leading up to and following her death traumatize Estha and Rahel permanently. The novel follows an interesting narrative pattern. Half of it takes place in the past, over 2 weeks in 1969, when most of the events in the novel happen, and half of it takes place on one day in 1992, the present. Estha and Rahel are 7 years old in 1969. They live with their mother, Ammu, and part of their extended family, including baby Kochama, Ammu's cruel and prejudiced aunt. The twins' surrogate father figure and longtime friend is Velutha, an untouchable who grew up with Ammu. Readers learn that when they were children, Velutha made Ammu wooden toys, and she broke the social divide between their castes by allowing him to touch her hand. In 1969, they realize they are in love with each other and begin a longed-for but highly forbidden affair that sets in motion the entire rest of the novel. Now let's discuss traumatic narratives. The God of Small Things is a trauma novel, which means it follows a traumatic narrative. In fiction, traumatic narratives are a way of immersing readers in the characters' states of mind. Throughout The God of Small Things, Roy does this in many ways. The novel's shifting timeline between 2 weeks in 1969 and the one day in 1992 disorients readers, forcing them to experience the same dislocation and distress of the characters. In addition, the narrative adopts almost exclusively a childlike tone, which allows readers to experience the thoughts and feelings of Estha and Rahel as children. It features clipped, incomplete sentences and paragraphs, combined words and non-words, emphatic capitalization and punctuation, and repetition of words and phrases, all of which are typical to the speech and thought processes of children. We are not 7-year-olds, but we share in 7-year-old Estha and Rahel's horror as if we were. Another aspect of Roy's traumatic narrative is the novel's nonlinear plot, in which the character's trauma comes before the traumatic situations that cause it. This confuses readers and conveys trauma by urging us to feel the characters' reactions to the traumatic events, even though we don't yet know what those events were and why exactly they were traumatic. Indicative of its traumatic narrative, The God of Small Things makes allusions to 1969 from cover to cover, not just in the beginning of the narrative. In Chapter 11, readers get a glimpse into a moment in their lives that will happen after Sophie Mole's funeral. Roy writes, "What they had done would return to empty them, but that would be later. Later. A deep-sounding bell in a mossy well. Shivery and furred like moth's feet. At the time, there would only be incoherence, as though meaning had slunk out of things and left them fragmented, disconnected." This passage is the perfect example of Roy's traumatic narrative style. It distorts time and reads like a child's thoughts, so readers experience the same trauma Estha and Rahel feel over the still mysterious what they had done. Until the last 2 chapters, there are still more references to those 2 weeks that readers can feel but don't understand. Through the traumatic narrative, readers experience the character's trauma when the reference is made, but because the situation that caused that trauma was not within their consciousness, readers witness the traumatic event as a distant observer, already knowing how its outcome will affect the people directly involved. Now let's discuss witnessing trauma. We as readers spend a lot of time with Estha, Rahel, and the rest of the characters before we learn the details of what has happened to them. We learn that by page 6, Sophie Mole has died, but we don't know anything about the events surrounding her death or how it relates to Estha and Rahel. Regardless, the pain they feel is evident in the narration. Roy writes, "Estha and Rahel were 7 years old when she died. Sophie Mole was almost 9. She had a special child-sized coffin, satin-lined, brass handles shined." The vivid image Roy paints of these 7-year-olds standing beside a 9-year-old lying in a coffin elicits grief in the reader, even though the reader is witnessing the true grief over her death secondhand. The clipped sentences, physical details only, echo the internal emptiness that comes with a sudden death. Like people who have not yet processed a traumatic event, we are led to grasp at tangible objects as a grounding mechanism. By the end of chapter 1, we also learn that Estha and Rahel, who were so close as children that they are described as having joint identities, have been separated for 23 years, independently haunted by 1969. They are called quietness and emptiness, respectively, throughout the narrative, highlighting how their separate personal traumas affected them in different ways. We learn that by the time they reunite in 1992, Estha has stopped speaking, but we don't yet learn why. The narrator reveals vague, quote-unquote, terrible pictures in his head that traumatized Estha 23 years ago to the point of total silence. The narrative reads, "But worst of all, he carried inside him the memory of a young man with an old man's mouth, the memory of a swollen face and a smashed, upside-down smile. And what had Estha done? He had looked into that beloved face and said yes. Yes, it was him." The narrative prompts readers to experience Estha's trauma, the painful memories, the guilt he now feels for simply existing in the world, without knowing who the face in his memories is or why Estha saying yes caused them both so much misery. On to witnessing events. Other traumatic events happen in 1969 that we as readers feel throughout the novel because Roy alludes to them before she explains them. Estha is sexually abused by a man at a theater, and Ammu gets disowned by her family because of her relationship with Velutha. But it isn't until the last 30 pages of the book that we finally learn about the one major traumatic event Roy has alluded to since page 5. By the time we learn what happened, we know almost everything else there is to know. We know that Sophie Mole has died. We know that Velutha has been arrested. We know that for 23 years, Estha and Rahel have carried with them an overwhelming amount of guilt. We have grieved with these characters, and we have felt their trauma, but until the last 3 chapters of the book, we haven't known why. One night in 1969, Estha, Rahel, and Sophie Mole decided to take a boat down the river. When it capsized, only Estha and Rahel managed to make it safely to shore. They didn't go home after that, but decided to sleep in a corner of the boathouse, unaware of Velutha sleeping across the room. A little while later, Estha and Rahel woke up to the sound of policemen kicking Velutha, and they watched helplessly as the policemen beat him to an inch of his life. One of the policemen found the twins and took them to the station while the others dragged Velutha. At the station, the twins were coerced by baby Kochama, who had found out about Ammu and Velutha's affair, into telling the police that Velutha kidnapped them. Estha was the one who looked at Velutha in the station and, when asked if this was true, told the officer yes. It doesn't matter that only now we realize that Estha's memory of a smashed face back in chapter 1 has been Velutha all along. It doesn't matter that only now we understand why Rahel thinks she and Estha hold the most blame. We read about this night in 1969 with pre-established empathy because we already know that the trauma and suffering it causes will follow the surviving characters for the rest of their lives. And because we witnessed the trauma before the traumatic event, we have formed solidarity with the characters and related to that suffering in an ethical way. The ethics of witness. An ongoing concern in literary trauma theory is whether or not the audience is reading a trauma novel ethically. When witness to the intimate trauma of others, readers must be delicate in how they receive that trauma. They walk a fine line between empathizing with characters' trauma and appropriating their traumatic experiences, or between being caring witnesses and exploitative voyeurs. In an article titled A Martyrology of the Abject, literary critic L. Chris Fox comments on how the traumatic structure of the narrative forces readers to experience the trauma of the abject as if they are already subject to it. Because readers experience more of what the characters feel through the narrative than what happens to them through the plot, Roy allows readers to experience the abject without the danger of appropriating the individual events that have happened to the characters. Then, the reader takes on the responsibility of recognizing the individuality of the characters' traumatic events and relating to the quote-unquote detailed descriptions of their pain and humiliation instead. The main goal of traumatic narratives is to put readers in the same mindset as the main characters. Through The God of Small Things' frequent and mysterious allusions to the events of 1969 and reflections on the aftermath of those events, We can connect with Estha and Rahel in particular through their trauma. In this way, we see them as fellow sufferers, imagining their pain and humiliation is really our own. This is a practice philosopher Richard Rorty calls creating solidarity. Solidarity occurs when we dismiss traditional differences such as race or religion and relate to another person through the experience of suffering. An important point of Rorty's is that solidarity is not something that exists simply because we are all human. Solidarity is something we have to create by empathizing with someone else based solely on their suffering. By creating solidarity with others, we recognize a collective us, including others who are vastly different than ourselves. Applied to literature, we create solidarity with the characters by relating to their suffering and empathizing with it. In the case of trauma novels, the solidarity the reader creates with the characters has the potential to be more powerful than in other novels. Through the traumatic narrative, readers are introduced to characters' suffering by feeling it instead of just witnessing it. In the case of The God of Small Things, readers are introduced to Estha and Rahel's suffering by feeling it before witnessing it. By the time we witness the events that cause their pain and humiliation, or what allows us to create solidarity, the solidarity between us and Estha and Rahel is already present. We, as Rorty writes, have a moral obligation to feel a sense of solidarity with all other human beings. In that way, The God of Small Things not only engages us in ethical quandary, it allows us an ethical solution. Readers who also feel guilty for taking up space can find solace in Estha. Readers who struggle to overcome the fear of being unlovable in Rahel. Readers who grieve the loss of something dangerous but fiercely desired in Ammu. We as readers have related to Estha, Rahel, and Ammu despite the differences between ourselves and them, because we have related to their pain and humiliation. Through Roy's traumatic narrative, we have empathized with them and their suffering before we even knew why. We are not thieves or voyeurs then. We are simply humans concerned for other humans, witnessing their trauma not for entertainment, but for ethical resolution. In closing, I would like to thank NC State for allowing me to share this with you, as well as Professor Jim Hood at Guilford College for overseeing my research. Thank you very much for your time.